So we're here gathered, and the title of this event is Episcopal Tent, How Big Is It? And this question, for me, was really interesting, this how big is it question. Because depending on where you find yourself, this question can hit your ears or come out of your mouth a little bit differently, right? So if you find yourself sort of located maybe in the center of the tent, for whatever reason, for whatever social location that you might be a part of, whether you're a cradle Episcopalian, or you love to read music, or if English is your first language, or if you're from the dominant social group, meaning you're white, male, cisgender, overeducated, whatever it is, maybe it's all of those things.
Overeducated. I like that.
Maybe you identify with all those things, maybe you identify with some of those things, but if you find yourself there in that center of that tent, you might look out and you might feel like you belong. And you might say, whoa, this is huge. How big is this tent, right? But if maybe you find yourself on the edges of the tent, where maybe you didn't grow up Episcopalian, maybe you're young, maybe you're queer, you're a person of color, maybe English isn't your first language and you have no idea how to read music, maybe you're even illiterate, maybe you're all those things, maybe you're only a few of those things, but if you're on the edge, you might be trying to push your way in and find space, and you might see that space and be welcome, but then you might get pushed out, right? And so you might be sitting there thinking, how big is this tent actually? I'm not quite sure how big it is. So I'm wondering, there's a tension here with that question, right? And it's a spectrum, and that's sort of both ends of the spectrum. And for you, I can imagine in your life and in your leadership in the church that you've probably have experienced both of those. You have both found yourself at the center and have felt like you've belonged, and maybe you have found yourself on the edges trying to get a space to belong. And so I would love to just hear from you about that tension in your life and the ways that you've experienced that great expansive welcome, or in times where you might have had to struggle to belong.
What interests me in this question and sort of the title, and I was thinking about this coming down to New Bedford, is that it includes the problem. And the problem is the space. The problem is the walls. The problem is saying a tent. Now, I'm assuming we sometimes use tent because it moves around. Because the biggest problem of any kind of openness to everybody is that we expect people to arrive someplace. And so the people who are in the middle of that place are the most comfortable in that place. When I was growing up, I grew up in the Bronx. I grew up like a number of black people in urban areas in a neighborhood where the majority non-black population was Jewish. And so when I looked around, when I was growing up, I thought all Christians were black and all white people were Jewish.
Oh.
Now, I had the advantage, though, even though I went to an Episcopal church, which, of course, was all black, mostly West Indian, right, is that every once in a while, we went to another Episcopal church. And I found out that there were white Christians at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. Right? So you're absolutely right about where you are, because sometimes you can be on the edge, but you have made a middle for yourself, which is what black people have done in the Episcopal Church. And sometimes, even then, there is no place where certain people can have a middle.
Well, I was intrigued by the theme of this afternoon, talking about the big tent which this church proclaims. And I'm not as sure that the tent is as big as we proclaim it to be. Or we may have inadvertently closed some of the flaps by which people can meaningfully come in. And so I'm all for making the tent bigger, but I don't think it's as big as we say it is. And when I say I think we have closed some of the flaps by which people can meaningfully enter, there are certain tenets to which we subscribe and adhere and expect them to do so also. I think for this really to be a big tent, we have to more fully live into the words, come in under the broad umbrella of faith. Period.
The word of the Lord. Thanks.
That's good.
I got nothing to say after that. What are you going to say after that?
Okay, I want that recorded.
Oh, yeah.
Well, there you go.
Oh. Well, you know, I agree. I actually do. I think the reality is that we are not as big a tent as we sometimes think. We're not as small as we once were.
That's right.
And I suspect that the tension is that we are somewhere between who we actually are, which is a mix. It is a mix. And what we know, like Bernadette taught us, God's dream for us actually is. And we're not there yet.
Right.
For me, one of the struggles is not to be complacent with where we are, but to kind of do what Paul was getting at in Philippians. And I know folk have issues with Paul sometimes, but he was having a good day when he said this. And he said, not that I have already attained, but I press on toward the mark of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. And I think if we see ourselves as the pilgrim people on the journey, constantly trying to have the tent resemble the fullness of God's reign and God's glory and all of that, if we're doing that, then it's when we get satisfied with where we are and who we are. And you're absolutely right. The tent is small and constricting. No, you think the tent is bigger when you're at the center.
Right.
You actually think it did, but when you're on the edge, it's not that big because it doesn't feel like there's room for you. And you know, it's so funny when Byron was talking about your image of the church. I grew up in the Episcopal Church. I assumed all Episcopalians were black too. I did. And I just figured the only white Episcopalians were bishops, and they only came and visited once a year. I mean, when I was a little kid, I remember. I just assumed. I think, and that's why they had special clothes on. It was really nice to have a visiting.
That's right.
Yeah. Then later on, I figured it out. But still,
I grew up in the Episcopal Church. I knew there were white Episcopalians because I had to pass a white church to wait for the bus to get to my church.
Oh.
And
Right.
the son of the rector of the white church was in my class, in my 6th grade class. And while I was waiting for the bus to get to my church, my all-black church, Roger was on the porch of the rectory waving to me while I waited for the bus. And then I would see him on Monday, and he'd say, "How was it?"
Did he really?
But I couldn't go into his church.
Wow. Yeah.
I think it's really essential that we understand this call for being a church for everyone, how countercultural it is.
Yeah.
Got to understand that. We can't get anywhere if we don't understand that this is one for America, one of the most bizarre ideas ever proposed for Americans. Right? Most Americans live in segregated communities. Most, still today. Most white people in America, right, when they wake up and go to work, don't see a person of color unless that person of color is coming into their town to work, usually in the house.
Yeah.
Right? They don't see them. So when white people get into a situation where there's a few black people around, right? Maybe at work, maybe they have come and moved back to Boston, maybe they live in the South End, right? They think they're in the most diverse community in the world because they see black people on the street.
Yeah.
That makes it diverse and satisfying.
Yeah.
And they don't have to do anything else. I have a sort of spiritual discipline I give all white people that they should do for a year. They should have a notebook, and every time they're in a meeting when a decision is made about anything, they should count the people of color in the room.
Yep.
About anything. Count the people of color in the room. I don't have to ask black people here to do that, because they do that automatically. I was once give an introduction or welcome to the Chamber of Commerce meeting, some big Chamber of Commerce meeting in Boston. The speaker asked me to go do it because he hated to do these. So I was a lowly, and I had to go do it. And when I showed up, the meeting had just started, and so all the spotlights were on, and I couldn't see anybody in the audience. I gave my little welcome talk, right? And then I'm leaving, and I see a black person at a table while I'm walking out of this huge convention. And I say to him, "Oh, how many black people are here?" 7. He didn't hit 7. He didn't have to. He didn't take a breath.
Oh, yeah.
And he had already counted the people in the
counted.
room. Right. So count the colored people in the room, and then you see how close to the center they are.
Right. Yeah, when you are talking about counting the people in the room, and with what you're saying, Bishop Curry, about following after God's dream, the question that I have is, how do you make sure we're following actually after God's dream, and not the dream of the people who are there, who are the dream makers or the dream weavers, right? So the people who are in the room are usually the ones in the room that get to decide, who get to make these decisions on behalf of everyone. So how do we just make sure, how do we know what's our compass in making sure that we're not following after just our dream, especially if we look around and we just see the dream looks like me?
Well, this is going to sound trite, and I don't mean it to sound trite. Ask yourself what got Jesus killed.
Say again.
Yes.
Ask yourself what got Jesus killed.
Yes. Yes.
He got in real trouble when he knocked over the tables of the money changers in the temple and said, "My house shall be a house of prayer for all people, but you have made it a den of thieves." Right there, you see the crucible, and that's what started the trouble for Jesus. I mean, he had some early trouble, but that way of being, that way of actually not including from a throne, but actually being open and vulnerable to others, those outstretched arms on the cross, that really did not include on my terms, but because we're children of God, that kind of opening, that caused the reaction from that. Ask yourself what is, as you said, countercultural, almost counterintuitive for me. But I mean, it's more natural for me to want to be with people who are like me and who agree with me, because I don't have to work as hard. I got to tell you, it's work to be a minority in a majority culture, whether that's racial or whether that's gender or that's orientation or whether that's political. Because, see, you have to always be on. You have to always be thinking. If you're the majority, I haven't had that experience a lot, but the time when I've had it, I didn't realize how easy it was. I said, no wonder folk want to be in charge, because you don't have to do nothing. Right? You don't have to have strategy. You don't have to think. How is that? You really don't. You don't have to figure out, how do I move into the center of the tent? How do I make this change? Your being is counter to the culture automatically. You see what I mean? So you have to work harder. When I was a little boy growing up, I was taught. This was drilled into me. You got to be better than the best just to be average.
Right.
Yeah.
You got to be better than the best just to be average. You don't have the option to just be average. That was not, they weren't wrong. I mean, you know, I'm sure there are a lot of black kids now on psychiatrists' couches dealing with that. But the reality is, that was a strategy, an internal strategy for how you navigate a system where you are actually at the edge, no matter how much it looks like you at the center. And that, put all of that, and that is because it is intrinsically countercultural and almost counter to, I don't want to say human nature, but it almost counter to the way just human being we are. And so the reality is, I think that's what got Jesus killed. He dared to challenge that by the power of a love that knows, Bishop Allen was saying yesterday, that knows no limits except near Boston, New York Yankees are not allowed. That's the only limit. And I think that's almost a litmus test. If it is countercultural, if it's likely to get you in trouble, if it's what God Jesus, I know that's a negative way to say it. Because if everybody's for it, look out. You have to be careful.
I think the word cultural is very important here, and I think we need to sort of dwell on it, because I think what we are pretty sophisticated in the way that we, in the Episcopal Church, because of a lot of work that has been going on in the past few years around race and racism, right? So I think we all know that racism is an invention, right? I think we all know that. I think most people here, so if you're not shaking your head yes, then you haven't gone to an anti-racism workshop, and shame on you, right? So, but that means it's invented. You see, that means it's not natural. It means it was taught from the very first moment that we were taught anything in this country, right? It was taught. Right? And so white people do not wake up in the morning and say, how can I be a supremacist? They don't need to. You see, they don't need to, because the culture is a culture that assumes that, right? You could pick up a newspaper and they tell you what some euphemistic way, they're not as direct as they used to be, but they tell you the color of the criminal. And so we used to always know that when you picked up the newspaper and we didn't know the color of the criminal was white. Right. Because they never say the white person shot somebody.
It's
right?
true. It's true.
Right? Because that's just cultural. That's the way it is. Yeah. And what we are asking in the Episcopal Church when we say this, that we are going to be a church for everybody, it means that we are going to be an un-American church. We are going to be a countercultural church because we're going to be for everybody. And Barbara's frowning.
No, I'm not frowning. I'm hearing you and agreeing with you, but I just want to come at this in a little different way. I think about when we gather as a church and pass and entertain and pass restrictive resolutions that would exclude some people from full participation in the life of the church, then we are being Antichrist. And I think about some of the resolutions that this church has tried to pass and has passed. And I think that we then exclude some people from participating in life under the tent. I can remember years ago, I was a lay deputy to General Convention, and somebody got up and offered a resolution that said the Episcopal Church does not believe that homosexual people can be ordained. And then I got up and said I would like to amend the resolution. And John Coburn was president of the House of Deputies at that time. And he said, for what purpose does the deputy at microphone 9 rise? And I said, I rise to offer an amendment. And he said, what is your amendment? And I said, the Episcopal Church no longer believes that homosexual people can be ordained.
Oh, yeah.
Since we've been ordaining them since the whatever century, you know, beyond my memory. And this gasp went down the center of the room. And somebody said, I don't believe she said that. And Jay Walker, who became the Bishop of Long Island, said, I know her. She said it.
You know,
I want to speak to, you know, because we should not forget that we are a church. And I think that's probably that, you know, in the list of things that are countercultural, just to try to be a church, to understand being a church is probably countercultural. I mean, because it's so hard for us to try to be an institution that's not affected by the way other institutions do things. Right? And so a lot of what we consider positive developments are usually trying to make us act like some other successful kind of institution. Right. But we have the authority on what we're talking about this afternoon. We have the authority. We have the person who has told us how to do it.
Right.
And you, of course, referenced that person. Yep. That person is Jesus.
Yep.
We have been told how to do this. Jesus is probably here to try to figure out a way to get us to do this because we paid attention to nothing else until he came. And that's our understanding, right? You know, we have this a wonderful spiritual, right? Where Jesus is singing to God and he says, give me one body.
Oh, yeah.
I'll go down. Yeah. I'll go down. Give me one body and I'll go down.
Yep.
Right? And that, of course, is the center of our faith. And that we have the authority, and if we could live that way, right, we would be on our journey toward this end.
I agree.
Right?
Yep.
And like all great truths, our first reaction to that is to minimize it, is to figure out ways of saying, he didn't really say that. He didn't really say that. Right? How many sermons?
Or he didn't mean it.
And he didn't mean it
that way.
How many sermons have you been to when the priest gets up and tells us he didn't mean it? He didn't mean that rich people it's gonna be the hardest thing for them to get into heaven. He didn't really mean that.
That was a
right?
parable.
He didn't really mean blessed all the poor.
No.
He meant blessed all the poor in spirit. Give me a break. Stop this.
It's true. It's true. It's, I mean, this is kind of off, and I don't mean to get to it, but it's related to that. If you listen to Christian voices that are advocating what are clearly unchristian things in our culture right now in the U.S., I don't want to be too specific, but I think you can. I think y'all with me. Oh, that's right. I'm not in the South anymore. I can talk. I can talk. Yeah.
This is New England, right?
If you listen to right-wing Christians, or Christians in quotes, who are mimicking hostility toward immigrants and refugees, if you listen to right-wing evangelical, they tend to be right-wing evangelical Christian voices that have actually said in the public sphere, and I'm not saying anything out of school. This has been the president of Liberty University was quoted as basically, when he was asked, how can you consistently support all of the everything that the president and the administration is doing right now when some of it is contrary to what Jesus has taught? He was asked that in an interview and he basically replied that he hasn't done anything contrary to the Christian faith. He avoided Jesus completely. That's not an accident. Jesus is the problem if you really don't want to be Christian, but you want to play the game. Mm-hmm. Jesus is no help if you really want to be bigoted, if you really want to be racist, if you really want to be homophobic, you can go on and on and on. The truth is, Jesus is the ontological and I want y'all to know I did go to school.
You just don't want to be called overeducated.
Don't be overeducated. I know. I had a moment. It was a moment. And I think you are absolutely right in reclaiming Jesus of Nazareth, the teaching Jesus. Everybody loves Christmas Jesus, but the teaching Jesus. That teaching Jesus is a transformative revolutionary who will transform even the institutions that claim him. Right. And that you hit on something. We got our answer.
Right.
If we'll dare to live it or follow. Man.
But it's scary.
Yeah, it's scary. Because you saw what happened to him.
Well, that's in this. Why did you think in the other spiritual, why do we sing, I tremble? Tremble.
It causes me to tremble. Tremble.
Yeah.
Tremble.
Yes.
I know he rose from the dead, but he got killed first. I want to just skip over Friday, get to Easter,
That's right. Well, Barbara tells us we're supposed to be an Easter people in a Good Friday world.
Yes.
That's right. I listen to you.
You sure do. Because that's my mantra.
You're right.
Yeah, we are Easter people in a Good Friday world.
Yep. That's real.
Yeah.
Which means we're intrinsically countercultural. And that's hard for all of us.
Yeah, I was thinking about when you were saying countercultural and you were referencing Americans. Sometimes when I hear that, it sounds as if it's separate from the church, right? And I know that's not what you're saying. But that's the question for me is, and you were touching on it with it being difficult and scary to do the work. But when you are, sometimes it's just not separate, the church and the culture that is creating the Antichrist, if you will, in Barbara's words. So how do you, for each of you at different points in your lives, you've had, I can imagine, these crucible moments where you've had to lean in to the way of love and to the countercultural way of being. And those moments, those are those moments because they come at great cost to you. You might be receiving death threats. If you say yes to it, your life might actually be on the line. Those are the big ones, and I think some of us experience smaller ones, right? Where you might for me, it's like I might offend my uncle. And that can be actually
That's real.
scary, right? But what are those moments in your lives where those crucible moments happen, and what gave you the courage? Where did you draw that courage from to say yes despite it being counter, despite it being met with maybe death threats or your livelihood, or even would come with isolation, loneliness? How do you cultivate that courage to continue to show up to the way?
Well, I think a short answer for that, for me, to that, is to trust in the mercy of God to bring me out safely on the other side. And I experienced this years ago when I went to Greenville, Mississippi, and volunteered with the Delta Ministry to do voter registration in a hostile environment to register black people to vote in Greenville, Mississippi. And God knows, as I walked those streets and under threat of death, just to trust in God's mercy to bring me out safely on the other side. And certainly it did. And that has been true many times in my life. And I offer that to anybody who dares to live into the fullness of the gospel.
You know, I've learned that I'm a coward by nature. I wish I was courageous, and nah. I'm a coward. And
I'm not courageous, I'm just dumb.
Oh, I was just going to say crazy. Oh, okay, yeah. And I will never forget, this was the first time I think I had to make a decision that I didn't have a community of support for. I mean, for the years that I was a priest, I was a priest in black parishes. So when I was involved in community stuff, I actually had a base of support. I mean, I did for the most part. I mean, I did some things that people didn't, but I knew the landscape. But when I was first bishop of North Carolina, it was the first time I was really alone. At least initially. That changed over time, but initially, you know, I was a black guy, you know, a descendant of people who were sharecroppers and slaves in that state, and a lot of Sundays I'd go to churches, and my wife, we have a standing joke. Bishop Byron knows my wife. I sometimes nickname her Sapphire, because because she can be smart and she can get at me, but every time I'd come home on Sunday. And she said, well, how many black folk were in church? I said it was fully integrated. I was there. Right. I was there. It was fully said, how many Latinos were there? I said, it was fully integrated. I was there. I mean, and that would be on and on and on. And that was sort of, so there was a sense of being alone in one sense, and in another sense, no, I know that. But and I was blessed to work with Bishop Suffolk and Gary Gloucester, who mentored me. And we made a strategic decision, for example, that he led the anti-racism work, not me. And that was a strategic decision for a number of reasons. You know, why do you always have the black folk got to do that work? And said, this is work we need to all do together, but that's white people need to lead this cause. And we'll work together, but we need, anyway, we made a decision about that. And a few years into my episcopate, about 3 years in, my old friend Gene Robinson got elected Bishop of New Hampshire. And I know Gene for a while. And I had successfully maneuvered the terrain of human sexuality with all of the skills of diplomacy and Anglican alacrity and ability so as to survive. And the Diocese of North Carolina had successfully straddled that. North Carolina is mid-state. It's not hardcore Dixie. It's somewhere. North Carolina voted for Barack Obama and then voted for Romney the next time.
Right.
That's North Carolina, and that's the nature. It's a moderate state. And so it had struggled with that. And I remember making a decision that I was going to say that I was going to support his nomination or his election, give confirmation to it,
Right.
before the General Convention, a month before. And I thought about it and prayed over it, and I was scared to death. And I just did it, not because I'm courageous. Sometimes you just gotta, it's like Nike, you just do it. And nothing happened for a while till after the General Convention. And I asked somebody later, why didn't people get mad initially, and now all hell's breaking loose? And he said, well, nobody really believed you meant it. And then all of a sudden, reality hit home. And all hell broke loose. And all of a sudden, the demons who had been locked up since no, they weren't locked up. They were just waiting, laying low. Demons came out. Nobody had said the N-word in reference to the bishop until then. Then all of a sudden, stuff started coming out. And I remember one Sunday having these, like we had these town hall meetings, and it was basically, let's shoot the bishop. But anyway, town hall meetings, and it was just a nightmare. And there were times when I felt, I'm all by myself. I wasn't, but I felt like it. Gary Gloucester was right there. He said, I'm with you, man. I was supposed to retire, but I'm going to hang on another year for you. He hung on another 4 or 5 years, but that was all right. And there was one time when a woman came up to me. We were in, I think it was in Raleigh. And she came up to me and she said, sir, you have brought disgrace upon the Episcopal Church, and your actions may well destroy the great Diocese of North Carolina. Let me tell you something. That woman got me. It hit. Told my canon to the ordinary about that. Marie Fleischer, Philadelphia. One of the original women ordained in Philly. Was my canon to the ordinary then. She brought me a little thing with John Wayne on it. Anyway, that just happened to be it. And it had a quote. Courage has nothing to do with not being afraid. Courage is being scared to death and getting on the horse anyway. And that's when I realized courage has nothing to do with cowardice. It just has to do with finally saying this is the right thing. We've got to stop being a church that hurts anybody and just doing what's right.
Well, you might be interested to know that I'm going to fully integrate one of the parishes in North Carolina week after next.
Oh, you would do it?
in Durham. And
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to be preaching at their request on racial justice. So
They would. They're great folk.
so tell Sapphire.
Tell
that-
Sapphire
that-
you're
that-
coming.
That I'll be in Durham, and the church will be fully integrated because I'll be there.
Yeah. But I have to tell you a story related to that. It's quick. Right soon after that, things actually did evolve and change and grow. I mean, they did. And when there was a constitutional amendment, we were one of the states that got hit with that, defining marriage is only between a man and a woman and all that kind of. I was allowed to be publicly in opposition to that, and liberal and conservative Episcopalians supported that. The capacity of human beings to grow is real. It really is real. And I saw that. And they, Episcopalians, and I suspect most of the lay people in the Episcopal Diocese of North Carolina probably were Republicans, or they're kind of the George Herbert Walker Bush Republican, but they knew something was intrinsically wrong about that. And Episcopalians in that diocese opposed that amendment, whether they were red or blue or whatever it is. They did because there was some growth, because there was some honesty. And I kept saying, we just want to be like Jesus and follow Jesus. And you know what? They listened. People can grow. People can grow.
Well, I think this is one of the things that we should all just remember about the Episcopal Church, is that it has this incredible ability to raise these issues. Now, there are always people, our fellow Episcopalians, who have a hard time with that, sometimes so hard they have to leave. But we have been able to, in a sense, each time we are confronted with an issue around denying humanity, we can reflect on times before that we weren't in front of the issue. I think, I absolutely believe that the Episcopal Church getting in front of the whole question of denying the humanity of people because of their sexuality so quickly came from knowing how badly we did around the same issue with black people, how slow we were, right? And we had, and so when we heard these words for the first time, we said, wait a minute, wouldn't it have been wonderful if we could have heard those words for the first time around black people 100 years ago, right? When some of you will remember that in 1976, when we voted to allow women to be ordained in this church, that at that same convention, a deputy from the Diocese of Newark, right, stood up with a resolution that said that we would recognize that homosexuals, and that was the nicest word we knew in those days. That homosexuals were children of God. It was a resolution passed,
I remember that.
right,
1976,
by the General Convention that same year, right? And so we had something there that we could reflect on. I certainly, I'm, one of the advantages of having been an elected official is that when you're an elected official, everybody knows your morality because it's posted on a board. It says yes or no every time you vote. So you know where I am on these issues. So I don't have to go around and say, this is what I did. They publish it in the newspaper. And when we had when the Goodrich decision passed here, that said it was unconstitutional by a state constitution to prevent same-sex marriage, and the reaction of conservatives, and these were some pretty, not far right-wing, but some centrist conservatives here, was to change our constitution, to have marriage defined in our constitution. And so that became a big battle, right? And I tell people that as a Christian, the first thing that you would assume that I would reflect on was some Bible passage or some great snazzy line from an Anglican theologian, like people are mostly right in what they affirm and wrong in what they deny. That's Frederick Morris.
That's good.
Right?
Yeah.
Right?
That's good.
but what immediately came to mind was the fact that this had passed this General Convention in '76, and I thought, if we could pass a General Convention in '76, we can make this thing work in Massachusetts. We can keep this constitutional amendment from ever happening in Massachusetts.
So I have to step in here.
Oh, yeah.
Because time has gotten away from us, and I have to be that person. I'm sorry. I'm going to ask one more question and sort of the last word here, all right? So each one of you.
That's right. You know, she only asked us 2 questions. You know?
I thought I took
You
a
were
bet
good.
that it was going to be 2.
You were really good. I mean, you got
So one of the things that a mentor taught me a long time ago was that you can never call yourself a prophet, right? Like you can only be named a prophet, right? And I see you 3 as people that I've admired for a while and that I would name as prophetic witnesses in this world. And when I was in seminary, overeducated, one of the things that I loved in my class about prophets was this little saying that they gave messages of weal or woe. I'd never heard that before. But weal being messages, you know, of blessing, of encouragement, of going out there and doing your thing, keep doing it, right? And then woe, of like, you better turn around. Come to Jesus moment, right? And I'm wanting to hear from you all a message of weal and a message of woe for the church, for those assembled here.
Well,
I stumped them.
my mother used to say to me, growing up, pray to God and ask people. So that's my word of weal.
Great.
Now, I'm not going to deal in words of woe.
Okay. Okay.
Pray to God and ask people. And some right will come out of it.
So I'm with Barbara on this. I think that most of of us in this room could give the woe list real fast, right? I am convinced that the authority is Jesus. And I am more and more convinced that he is with us for this one reason, to have us understand that we are all human beings and have to love each other. That there is no love if we can figure out ways of having some list of people that we don't have to love. Then the other love is really irrelevant. That we have to love everybody. And that participation is on us. And I think that's what, I think Paul saw the body of Christ as a metaphor. I think Avila, Saint, got it right, that it's not a metaphor, it's a reality, that we are Jesus. We are Jesus. So his hands, his feet, who do we ask? Who do we expect to ask us? Because they're asking Jesus. And what is our response? Because when we are asked, we are Jesus. And
Amen.
when we don't do it,
Pray to God and ask people.
yes.
I'm going to say amen and amen to them. Really. Yesterday morning, I was with the 20s, 30s group. Is that the name of the 20s, 30s group? And I have to tell you, and I thank you, Massachusetts, for what was one of the only word I have, and I don't mean the only word I can think of to describe it. It was holy, because they were asking questions, and we got in a conversation They were asking about how do you run the race and keep running. Because it's hard. And opposition within and without is real. And it's like you said, Byron, you got to keep looking at Jesus. For the joy that lay before him, he endured the cross, despised the shame, and now sits at the right hand of the throne of God. To keep eyes on him. Because Palm Sunday is real and everybody's happy. And Good Friday is real and ain't nobody happy. Mm-hmm. But Easter's always coming.
Yeah.
And so I told them yesterday, I said, Michael Curry doesn't have any wisdom. But there's some old folk who used to pick cotton, tobacco, lost all semblance of human freedom, who used to say it this way: walk together, children.
Don't you get
weary.
weary.
Because there's a great camp meeting in the promised land. That's it. That's it. That's it. That's it.
Thank you, thank you.
That's it. Yeah.
Hand it over to you for a blessing.
For a blessing?
Yeah,
Okay.
please.
Well, I'll say the words, but I think Vice President Rushing would agree with me. I'll be the mouthpiece, but Moses is standing between the two of us.
All right.
All right.
Right. But that's the closest we get to the transfiguration.
That's about as close as we get. Yeah. Go forth into the world in peace. Be strong and of good courage. Hold fast to that which is good. Render to no one evil for evil. But love the Lord your God. Love your neighbor. And love yourself. The blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit be on you and on us and the entire human family and all of God's grand and glorious creation this night and forevermore. Amen.
Please give a hand to our teachers, our prophets.
And to Katie.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I just look pretty. Thank you.